Okay, I think that we will start. Thank you all for coming to yet another conversation with an especially important policymaker here in Wisconsin. Today's visitor scarcely requires much introduction as the mayor of the city of Milwaukee, but let me give the briefest of biographical sketches of the Honorable Tom Barrett. Mayor Barrett is a native Milwaukeean. He is a graduate of Marquette University High School. He escaped Milwaukee for a few years for college and law school in Madison, but he returned home and has served the city of Milwaukee in a variety of different governmental capacities over the years. He has been a member of the State House, a member of the State Senate, a 5-term member of the United States Congress, and has been, for the past several years, serving after election as the mayor of the city of Milwaukee. So, Mayor Barrett, you do us a great honor in coming over here to Milwaukee's law school and speaking with us, and I hope that this will be the first of many visits on your part. I know you've been to Marquette University countless times over the course of your career, but we especially welcome you here to the law school. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dean Kearney, and thanks again to all of you for being with us today. We're glad you could join us, and we thank, obviously, Mayor Barrett for being with us today. Appreciate it. I thought we might begin with the perception versus reality question, and I want to get your take on this because they say perception is reality. How do you think Milwaukee is perceived by folks who live outside of Milwaukee and by folks who, frankly, live outside the state? How are we perceived right now?
I'd say right now the perception is it's one of those Midwestern cities, and I think part of that is because we have never, as a community, felt the need to promote ourselves. And I think that's one of the challenges that I have and one of the challenges the city has. When you think of Milwaukee 40 or 50 years ago, we had this reputation as being this great factory town, brewery town. The way I describe it is if you had a strong back and a good alarm clock, you could pretty much be assured of being able to support your families. And as that's changed in the last 40 years or so, I think we have to put more of an emphasis on talking about the good things about Milwaukee, and because we are competing with other communities, and talking about our livability, talking about our universities, our arts, entertainment, sports, natural beauty. So I think we have to do a better job in selling ourselves, and I think that that's one of the challenges we've had is we've never felt the need to sell ourselves. But I think we've got a product we can sell.
Let me bring up the issue of crime because you hear that, and that's become sort of the issue of the day, I guess, for some people. How much of a problem is that in terms of the city's image, do you feel?
Oh, it's obviously an issue. It's clearly an issue, and it's clearly a problem. We have neighborhoods in the city where there is far too much crime. This is a phenomenon that you're seeing in many cities throughout the country. I think it's important to keep it in perspective, though. Although we have seen increases in some areas, we also have to look, for example, in 1990 we had 160 homicides in the city. In 1991 we had 163 homicides. 1992 we had 157 homicides. So in a 6-year period we had 1,000 homicides. Last year we had 103, 106 homicides, I think. So the numbers are down, but if people perceive it as unsafe, then there's a problem. But I think it's also important to talk about the things that we do well. Jeff Norman's here from the Milwaukee Police Department, and he knows these figures better than I do. But if you look at, let me take 3 of the most recent, what I would call high-profile crimes that have occurred. One was a string of robberies on the south side, including one that was a homicide. The second one was a young woman who was 18 years old who was killed over on National Avenue. And the third was a fellow from Waukesha County who was filling his gas on Sherman Boulevard and Capitol Drive. It's important to note that in each of those cases, the Milwaukee police have solved the crime. In other words, they've caught the person who committed the crime. And so we have a very aggressive police department, and that's important. I think we have to have that. What I've done in the budget this year, for example, I've added an additional 50 police officers. Next year we'll add another 50 police officers. But it is an issue. I'm not going to sit here and say it's not an issue. It is an issue. But there's also the dynamic. For example, there was a writer here from Chicago on Saturday, or was here last week. He wanted to do an article, which he did over the weekend on Milwaukee. And he was talking about crime in Milwaukee. And I quite honestly started out by handing him the FBI statistics that had the 25 cities that they chronicled. And I think we were number 16 or 18 in that list. Chicago was 3 spots ahead of us. Now, he didn't include that in his article, that Milwaukee is actually safer than Chicago. And when you think about Chicago, I would bet there are people here, people who feel very comfortable going to Chicago. And I want them to feel comfortable going to Milwaukee with a lower crime rate than Chicago. And again, using Chicago as an example, Chicago just got the bid for the United States bid for the Olympics. So I don't think people are saying, well, let's close the lights on Chicago, let's move out. And I think it's important that we, again, keep things in perspective here. But again, I want to make this clear. It is the number one issue that I deal with. I deal with crime as an issue more than any other issue that I deal with.
Your critics accuse you of not having a plan. In fact, David Clark, the sheriff, was in here a few weeks ago, and he said about you, he doesn't have a clue on how to get a handle on crime in this area. Does that get under your skin? Is that just mere politicking? What is it?
You get used to that in this job. If this is a job where you want everybody to love you, this is not the right profession for you. He obviously had run for the job. It didn't work out for him. And I understand that there's going to be critics. You have a situation, though, where I have a very strong relationship with the police chief, with the district attorney, with the U.S. attorney, with ATF. We work with the State Department of Justice. And what we're doing, and I'll just give you a recent example. I had the police chief in my office 2 days ago, and we were talking about the area around 20th and Center, where we've had a lot more activity, and the steps that the police department is taking in that area. Cruising, the steps that will be taken this weekend to deal with cruising. So I deal with this on a daily basis. And again, what we're doing is we're putting more effort. We're putting more manpower into this than we've had in the last decade, essentially. The number of police that I've added to the police department this year is the largest increase in the Milwaukee Police Department strength in the last 11 years. So we are putting the resources there. We have, right now, the budget for the Milwaukee Police Department is $214 million. The levy for the entire city is $220 million. So it's the equivalent of 97% of the levy for the city. But again, there are going to be people that are going to be critical. And I'll tell you my message, and I give this message at community groups, is that we're going to have proactive police. We're going to have them out there cracking down on curfew, cracking down on cruising. You saw in the last couple of weeks cracking down on prostitution. Those are all the so-called quality of life issues that many people who, for example, admire Mayor Giuliani say we have to do. We're doing that right here in Milwaukee. We are.
Can I just jump in, though? The critics would say that the cruising problem has gone on for years now. Why are we still trying to get a handle on cruising?
Well, because you have new people who do it, and we tried different things. One of the things that several years ago, which I thought was actually a rather interesting idea, was you turn on the sprinklers at night, because a lot
around
of
the medians.
On the medians, and then people spend all day trying to get the cars looking nice. They don't want to have them look bad, but they also move around, and so you have new generations of people who are doing it. And I think the key is aggressive policing, but it's also
impounding cars, for instance. Can you do
that?
Yeah.
There are limitations as to what we can do, what the offense is, but we're putting more cameras out. We're doing that right now. We just had bids go out for cameras. So again, I recognize this as an issue, but I think the key here is aggressive policing, cooperation, and that is exactly what we're doing. Again, working with the district attorney, working with the State Department of Justice to the extent that we can do that, and sending the message to the bad guys, we're coming after you, we're coming after you, we're coming after you. And I think that's the important message that has to be out there. I frankly don't think the message of everything's gone to hell in a handbasket is a particularly true message. Again, if everything's gone to hell in a handbasket, well then why didn't we turn off the lights in the city in 1991 when we had 163 homicides? But I don't want to go back to those numbers. Let me make that clear. I have no desire to go back to those numbers. But I think the plan that's out there is to target the bad guys and to go after them. That's what it is. And I think if you're a general, which the police chief in essence is a general, you do that by going after the bad guys, not by holding press conferences.
What would you like to see in a new police chief, since there will be a new police chief soon?
Certainly, again, proactive is the number one word that comes to my mind. I want a police chief that's going to have a police department that's proactive in the community. We cannot be in a situation where all we are doing is responding to 911 calls. And that has been an issue in some parts of the city, the lag time in responding to 911 calls. So we just had a class graduate from the academy 2 weeks ago. The next class will start in mid-June of new recruits that go into the class. And so we are continuing to put people through that process. We'll have a third class later this year. So again, proactive police chief, someone who understands, and this is important, understands the ethnic makeup of this community. It has to be someone who understands that there are many different racial backgrounds, economic backgrounds, and that has been an issue in this community. And we all know that. The Jude case is a perfect example of that. We have to have a police chief that is going to address that issue and work with the community, because we have parts of this city where people choose not to call the police. And many times they're the very neighborhoods where I need the most cooperation between the police and the neighborhoods. And the third thing is I need someone who can work and have strong morale within the department. So there's sort of a three-pronged test I have. One, proactive. Two, strong ties with the community. Third, be able to garner the respect of the men and women who put their lives on the line every day. And I have to say this about the police. Having been in this job 3 years now, I have greater respect for the police than I did when I came into this job, because I can see what a tough job it is. This is a tough job, and it takes the right person to do this. And it's a large organization.
I mentioned Sheriff David Clark's name, and when he was here, and for those of you who were here, I told him at that time that I thought he sounded like a candidate for mayor. He had definitely had, some of you probably heard that, he had a message that he was pretty precise in his wording, and it seemed to have been carefully thought out, and there's been more of that in recent days. And in fact, earlier this week, he accused you of pandering by already endorsing Barack Obama in the presidential race.
I'm guilty. I did. I did.
Does he sound like a guy who's running for mayor? Would you like to see a rematch?
This is America. Anybody who wants to run, except for Mike Gousha, I would welcome into this race. How's that for an honest politician? I don't want this guy in the race.
I'm perfectly happy here, so we don't have to worry about that. But so you don't. Do you think he's running? Does it sound like he's running to you?
I honestly don't know. And again, if he wants to run, that's his decision. God bless him, and we'll have a campaign. We'll have a race. And I think I'm someone who's been through many, many different campaigns in my life. And they're the types of things where you get tested, and you should be tested. I call democracy the ultimate participatory sport. It works only as well as we make it work. And I like having people involved in elections. And I like having, and as long as it's an exchange of ideas, that's fine. But again, I will say right here that I want to have this city move forward. And in my mind, the issues are public safety, their education, and their jobs. Those are the big three that I think that we have to concentrate on.
Let's talk about jobs, and in fact, let's talk about the brain drain. That's a phrase that you hear a lot in Milwaukee. I remember Mayor Norquist used to dispute that notion. He talked about a brain gain. He did not believe the numbers that were out there. Do you think there is a brain drain? And if there is, how do we keep young folks like this in our community after they graduate from law school?
I think the way we keep them is by having good jobs at high-paying law firms, or
I'm sure they're in favor of that.
District attorneys, or finding public interest law firms that people can commit themselves to. I think it's about jobs, and that is the challenge. I think if you were asking me again, what my top priorities are: public safety, obviously, and jobs. And in my mind, this job is sort of a triangle. And the three issues are public safety, education, and jobs. Public safety, education, jobs. And they are all very related. And on the jobs front, again, I go back to 40 or 50 years ago, where I think that we have been slow as a community is how the world has changed. In fact, we never had to promote ourselves as a city. And what we saw is first the excess of jobs to the southern states that were not union states. Then we started to see jobs moving to Mexico, then jobs moving to China. And we have not done a good job, I believe, in updating the economy so that those people, particularly at the low end of the socioeconomic scale, have the ability to have a job where they can support their families. That to me is a critical issue for this community, and that's the issue that's related to education. So that they're all together. All three issues are together.
Well, let's talk more about those. What do you see as the economic engine that will drive Milwaukee, though? What kind of jobs are we talking about creating? What is realistic?
Well, we have to recognize that we are a town that has had a history of manufacturing, and I'm not going to abandon that history. There are going to be changes that take place in places like China, where it is now very attractive to move manufacturing, where they're going to start dealing with some environmental concerns that is going to make it less attractive to be there. So I always want to maintain and strengthen our manufacturing base. But we're never going to have the huge percentage that we had before in that. The jobs that we're going to have are going to require more education. And I never thought that as the mayor of the city, I would be saying what I'm about to tell you. But I go into the schools, and I talk to the students, and I introduce myself, and I say, I'm Mayor Tom Barrett, and I'm here, and I'm begging you to stay in school. I am begging you to stay in school. And that's how I start my message. And then I talk about a trip that I took to China, and I see Professor McCormick is here, who is our translator on that trip. And I talk about having gone to China, what an exciting trip it was, what an educational trip it was, and what a sobering trip it was because of their emphasis on economic development and on education, to the point where when I came home after a 13-hour flight home, got home, my 4 little kids were all sleeping, I went in and gave them a kiss, and then I wanted to grab them by the pajamas and say, now wake up and go downstairs and start studying. But I'm serious in that I think, again, one of the challenges for this community when it comes to education is to recognize how dramatically different the world economy is and how we have to put more of a premium on education. Now, that's not something that the mayor controls, but I do have a bully pulpit, and I do. Yesterday, I had the 2 basketball teams from Vincent High School. One, the girls team who won the state championship, the boys team who made the state, and we talked about it, and I told them how jealous I was that they were on this team. But then I didn't miss the opportunity to talk to them about you got to stay in school, and you're athletes, that means you're leaders. We have to, this is where we have to change the mindset of this community, that this community has to recognize that for jobs to allow people to support their families, whether it's in the financial field, whether it's in IT, whether it's in healthcare, whether it's in manufacturing, the days of having just the strong back and the good alarm clock are not enough. And we are doing a huge disservice to the people in this community if we're not getting that message across to the young people here.
You can make the argument, can't you, that Milwaukee will never be an entirely healthy city and that it won't have a middle class until Milwaukee Public Schools are doing better. Is that a fair argument to make?
I think you can pin it on the schools if you want. You can pin it on the emergency rooms where the kids show up because they don't have family physicians. You can pin it on the court system where the kids show up because they don't have a strong family support system. The schools are a challenge and a problem, I think many people would say. But it's not the schools. You go into the Milwaukee Public Schools and you're going to find some of the most dedicated teachers you've ever seen in your life. But they are dealing with challenges that you and I and the people in this room aren't dealing with in our daily lives. And that's one of the big differences, is if you don't have that family structure, how do you impart the message to the young person whose parents don't have it that this education is important? But we have to do that. We have to do that.
You and I talked about this at various points, actually during the campaign and afterwards, but it has happened in other cities like Boston and Chicago where the mayor has sought to have control over the public schools. You proposed that originally when you were running for mayor and then decided, no, I don't think there's going to be the kind of support I need to have that enacted. You do need legislative support there. But do you, now when you talk about MPS and you talk about the schools and their absolute critical role in the health of this community, do you regret not having stayed with that approach?
Well, no, and you're much more polite than many people are when you just, to tell you what happened, I floated the idea that the mayor should appoint the school board, and there were, was roundly criticized, I think is fair to say. And there were people who said, well, this is taking away democracy. And what I said, at that point, we had had 6 superintendents in 9 years. And I said, I don't care what the organization is, you cannot have 6 different CEOs in 9 years. And there were different factions. It was a very bitterly divided school board at the time. And I did have several successes. One success was, as bitterly divided as that school board was, I brought them together. I united them. They all hated me for suggesting such an audacious plan as taking over the schools. And the other thing, and Bill Andrikopoulos had just been recently appointed, and I saw him about 2 weeks later at the Hank Aaron run down at the ballpark, and I said, I've done more for your job security than anybody else in this community, because I started talking about you can't have 6 superintendents in 9 years, and he started chuckling, and he said, as a matter of fact, that week one of the members of the school board had come into his office and said, we should extend your contract. And quite honestly, I think that was probably a result of the fact that I had raised this issue that you cannot have that organization do it. So I think with Bill Andrikopoulos now into his 4th year, I think we have turned the corner on stability in leadership in the school system. And I enjoy working with him. We've got a good working relationship. I think that that's very important. We're working to try to get more resources. So I think right there, that's important. I think the movement towards smaller schools is helpful. If you look historically at the spikes in dropouts, historically you see a spike in dropouts essentially in the first year of middle school and the first year of high school. And the reason for that, I think, is sort of explainable. When you're in the grade school, by the end of the grade school, you sort of have your feet beneath you or your legs beneath you. Then you go to middle school, it's a little bit more turbulent seas, more kids. If you were struggling, that's where you get washed out because it's bigger and you just can't weather the storm. The same thing in high school. So by moving to schools in a system where you can have more individualized attention in the sense that you don't walk into a school with 1,800 kids, I think we're more likely to keep those kids who are on the teeter-totter and could fall out. So I worked with him to try to move in that direction, to try to do it. So there are plenty of places, to answer your question directly, there are plenty of places where I have been able to be involved in the education system without having to take it over, that I feel that I've been a positive source or a positive resource to it. And quite honestly, I don't have all the headaches that go along with it.
There are some folks who say that what younger people want in a world-class city is world-class transportation. In your most recent budget, you suggested several means to achieve that and suggested doing something called the downtown circulator. This would be a modern streetcar, I guess you could call it, that would have a 3-mile loop between tourist destinations downtown. You also talked about upgrading county bus service so you could get people in and out, nicer buses that it's called Comet, isn't it?
That's
it's like
right.
An express route. And then a hub at the Amtrak station that perhaps could allow you to do commuter rail right down to the Illinois border. It's an ambitious plan, but already the county executive says he doesn't want anything to do with it. It's going to cost too much. We don't have the funds to run it. We ought to put the money, what money we do have, into improved bus service, period. Is that going to happen?
Well, let me talk about that issue. I could talk about that issue for 5 hours. I'll try not to do it, but this is one that sets my soul on fire, I have to admit. I was a member of Congress, as you know, for 10 years. And before I even got to Congress, in 1991, there was $289 million that was authorized and appropriated. That means the money was sitting there in the piggy bank for Milwaukee to improve mass transit. $289 million. Later, it was reduced to $245 million. And that's when we had the big light rail debate. That's what the plan was, to use it for light rail. It went nowhere. There was an attempt to take that money from Milwaukee when I was in Congress that I fought, and with Senator Cole's help, we were able to defeat that. So the money remained there. But then there was an agreement that was reached among Governor Thompson, Mayor Norquist, County Executive Ament, to have some of that money used for Marquette interchange, some of it for the beautiful 6th Street Viaduct that goes down into the valley, some of it to help tear down the Park East. And there was $91.5 million that was set aside, again, to improve mass transit. So now, 2007, that money, $91.5 million, has been sitting, earning 0 interest to improve mass transit for this community. So I knew that the county executive in particular did not want to do anything rail related. And I know that there are others who want to put all of the money into rail. So quite honestly, what I attempted to do was to be a little Salm-esque in this and say, let's cut the money in half. Let's use half of it to improve bus service. and let's use the other half to get this downtown circulator that ties many of our attractions together downtown. In my experience, in my hunch, and there are critics who will say he's just trying to do something to grow the rail service in the city. And my response to that is, if you look at other communities in this country that started with a rail service, what you see is that the dynamic and the debate changes dramatically once it's in the ground. Rather than it being this boogeyman that everybody hates, people say, hey, look, you're seeing economic development along the line, and you're seeing other neighborhoods. Just as an example, Miller Park, the Potawatomi, the Harley-Davidson might say, well, let's have a line shoot this way. Or Brady Street saying, let's have a line shoot this way. Or let's have a line shoot toward Marquette. So I think that would, in fact, change the debate dramatically. But what I attempted to do in that plan was to use this $91.5 million in a responsible fashion in a way that would improve mass transportation. The last thing I want to see happen with that money, and I don't think it's an idle threat, is to have that $91.5 million that has been sitting there for 16 years for this community go to Portland, Oregon, or Indianapolis, Indiana, and have a light rail line or a mass transit connection dubbed the Milwaukee line. Because this community could not get its act together after 16 years on how to put forth a plan. So for those of you who don't like the plan, just forget you were even here. For those of you who think it makes sense for us to make some improvements, I'd ask you to contact the county and the county supervisors and say, I think it will happen. I think it will happen. And I'm going to continue to work on it because I think it's important. Again, I think it's an embarrassment that we cannot come together as a community in 16 years. And the argument you have is, first of all, the county has already tried to use this money for the operating expenses of the bus system. The federal government has consistently said this money cannot be used for operating expenses. So that's out the window. We frankly, we're trying to find ways to spend it within the bus system, but right now the federal government pays for essentially 80% of the buses, so we're getting that money now. But there are amenities that I think make this more attractive. If you've been to Washington, D.C., for example, or New York and ridden the subways there, one of the attractive features that I've always felt with those in the last couple of years is you're waiting for the train and it says next train coming in 3 minutes, next train coming in 4 minutes. If we start making those incredibly commuter-friendly changes, you're going to see people say, okay, I only have to wait 4 minutes for this bus, or I have to wait 9 minutes. I can adapt to that. They also, by having that GPS tracking and then having that advertised, it's a commercial for the bus system. And let's not forget the fact that gas is basically $3 a gallon now, and it could go much higher than this. And so it becomes more attractive to use mass transportation.
I'm going to ask one more question, then we'll open it up to the folks in here. But I did want to spend just a couple minutes on your experience as a congressman in Washington. You spent 10 years out there. They always say that there are two things you don't want to see in life. You don't want to see sausage being made, and you don't want to see laws being made. And I want to get your perception on how what the climate was like during your 10 years in Washington. And this is during the Clinton years and then Clinton impeachment.
Well, I have to say I've loved both jobs. So I'll give you a politician answer there, where I've been fortunate. I loved spending 10 years in Congress. I love being the mayor of this city. They are far more different than I ever imagined in terms of the jobs. This job is a much grittier job, and I don't use that as a positive and negative word. It's just, this is day to day. How do we make this city work? How do we move the city forward? And so it's a much more roll up your sleeves, make more enemies, quite honestly, in this job, because you're making more decisions, and you're just delving deeper and deeper and deeper into problems and issues. And everybody comes to City Hall. So again, I love this job. I absolutely love it. That job I loved in a different way. Intellectually, that was a very challenging job because you're dealing with issues that range the globe, whether you're talking about AIDS in Africa, whether you're talking about hurricanes, or whether you're talking about the Middle East. Intellectually, it's a very, very challenging job. Certainly the partisanship there in some ways made it harder, in some ways made it easier. I mean, you sort of knew that, and this is what I've sort of, now that I've been in the executive branch and in the legislative branch, the executive, for example, in forming a budget, comes in with this huge 2,000-pound boulder and puts it down. And for all the headlines and all the rancor that you see in the legislative bodies, usually it's about one side pushing the other side 3 inches, the other side pushing back the boulder 3 inches. It garners a lot of headlines, but there's not a lot of change from that. So it is a far more partisan world in Washington, D.C. I started out in the majority, and so I was part of that. But bear in mind, I came in the last 2 years of a 40-year Democratic run. So the speaker at the time, Speaker Foley, it wasn't as though he was calling any of us who were then new freshmen and saying, well, what do you think? You had the same crew that had been there for many years, and that was part of the reason that they were washed out, was because it was 40 years of one-party rule. Then going to the Republican rule, it was, in essence, because it's so party-driven, you had so many of the decisions that were made before you got to the floor. So that, after 10 years, as much as I loved it and found it intellectually challenging, I thought that from a personal standpoint, and that was a huge part of the decision, that it made more sense for me to come back to Milwaukee, because my family was here.
Why not go into private practice when you come back? Why not join a law firm? You come back from Washington. I'm sure you had those opportunities, and yet you continue to seek...
Well, I did join a law firm. I was with the Reinhardt firm for a while.
But you ran for governor.
Yep.
And, you sought public life.
Well, I think that there are different strokes for different folks. And I think for anybody to do something that sets your soul on fire, I think that that's the ultimate that you can have in your life, is something that sets your soul on fire. And I'll acknowledge, this sets my soul on fire, to try to do things to improve this community and move this community forward. I don't want to say what defines me as a person, because I have a family, but it certainly motivates me as a person. And I don't feel as though I'm going to work in the sense of, oh God, here we go, I got to go to work this morning. I'm excited about going to work. Even when people are throwing bricks at my face, that's part of the challenge. And I say that. I say, one of the challenges is being able to go before a crowd and have people shoot arrows at you and try to catch them with your teeth. That's part of the challenge of the job. And I enjoy that challenge.
Well, we'll see how gifted you are at that.
Bring it on. Bring it on.
Questions from here. Anybody have a question they'd like to ask the mayor? Yes.
I appreciate your comment about the intersection of education, jobs, things like that. And just as an example, I have a friend who's Taiwanese. She goes to the MBA program at the University of Illinois Champaign. Of 100 students in the MBA program there, 35 of them are from Taiwan. What that creates is this huge incentive in Asia, in Taiwan, and in China, where all these people have heard of the University of Illinois. All these students are going there. And it's increasing their stature both in Illinois and in the rest of the world. I guess my question is, what can we do to work with universities here to really reach out and try to address this globalization, try to plug into globalization through Marquette Law School, through UWM, and institutes like that?
Well, I think there are many ways to do it, but there's sort of a challenge in doing it as well. Again, going back to China, we sat in a meeting, and I was concerned, again, as a community that has exported a lot of goods to China. Now, we've had some recent successes with companies like Bucyrus International and Harnischweger and others, Joy Global, that have created a huge market for earth-moving equipment. So we've created a lot of jobs that way, but I think we have lost many jobs as well. And I will always remember sitting with one of the representatives over there and asking the question, what can we do to sort of have this imbalance change? And he said, well, there should be more invisible trade. And I thought, invisible trade, what are you talking about? Well, what they want, I think, and this is not shocking, is they want to benefit from all the knowledge we have in our universities here, so that they can start taking this knowledge and moving it there. So part of, there are opportunities to create those partnerships, whether it's in India, whether it's in China, whether it's obviously in Taiwan, that you can do that. And they're doing it because they want to raise the standard of living for themselves and for the individuals. I am far more concerned, again, and I'm pointing to Milwaukee specifically here, how we really have to just grab this community by its shoulders and shake it and say, this is a world economy. We have to keep our children in school. If a job can be done less expensively, it will be done less expensively in another part of the world if the job can be moved there. In other words, the person who cleans up this room after we leave here, that job cannot be exported to China. But if the person who made this bottle for this soda or this water can be moved to China, it's going to be moved to China or to Vietnam or to Indonesia. And I think that we have been so slow as a community in recognizing that reality that that's one of the greatest threats, I think, to the future of the city is instilling in the people in this community how important education is and training. And I'm not saying everybody's going to go to Marquette. I'm not saying everybody's going to go to UWM. But again, even the manufacturing jobs that remain, you have to have those math skills. You have to have the computer skills. And we have far many people in our school system who just don't understand that. And they're kids. So we can't expect them to understand that. But we as adults, we have to change that. And that is the most dramatic change that I think we have to undergo in this community.
Let's take another question. Anybody else have a question? Right here.
What future markets do you think that Milwaukee could really capitalize on in terms of the future ambition of progress from, would you say, the manufacturing?
Well, I think you can look at some of the strengths that we have in this area. And I had a visitor from the British Embassy that visited me several years ago. And he said he'd like to come to Milwaukee because the size of Milwaukee was more similar to the Manchesters and the Birminghams than a Chicago or a New York. And I said to him, and they had obviously lost a lot of manufacturing jobs in England. And I said, well, tell me from your perspective, what are the common denominators for those communities who have rebounded well after the loss of manufacturing jobs and those communities that haven't rebounded well? And he said that the common denominators were water and higher education. We're in good shape on both of those. Seriously. I mean, we're in good shape. We're in terms of the percentage of kids, young people that are in higher education. We're not Boston, but we're in the top 10. So we have that ability. Now, you talked about keeping them here. Okay, how do we keep them here? That's where the jobs have to come in. But the water, and look at Milwaukee. It's a perfect example. 25 years ago, there was one building, the Cudahy Towers, in downtown Milwaukee where people lived. Now you've got people like Mike Gousha who are moving to the water. And so what's happening is that there's this huge attraction of water. And it's amazing. It's all over the country. You see it in Chicago. I was in Chicago last week. You see it there in droves. You're seeing it more and more here. We've got essentially between 14,000 and 15,000 people living in downtown Milwaukee. So you've got that. The other thing, and this goes back to the image, and this is my request for you. You read articles of people comparing the Sun Belt to the Rust Belt or the Frost Belt, right? Now think for a second. Who coined those phrases? Were they someone living in the South or someone living in the North? The Sun Belt versus the Rust Belt. Sun versus Rust, or Sun versus Frost. From my perspective, this goes to the marketing of the city. People talk about what's going on the West Coast. They talk about how the dynamic economies on the East Coast, even the Gulf Coast. I think it's time that we start talking about what's going on the fresh coast, the fresh coast of America. That's what we are. And all of a sudden, which sounds better. And I know it sounds almost petty to some people, but people form ideas. You know, if someone says, "You want to move to the Rust Belt?" What would you say? If someone said, "You want to move to the fresh coast?" Well, it has a much better feel to it, I think. And that's what I mean when I talk about marketing the city. We live on the largest body of fresh water on this planet. It is a huge asset for us. And quite honestly, we can attract industries that use water. Now, we've got some very delicate issues having to do with the subcontinental divide and the Great Lakes. But quite honestly, in terms of industries that need water, we have the capacity in Milwaukee. That's one of the amazing and frustrating for the people who live west of the subcontinental divide. We have the capacity here to do that. So water industries, IT industries, certainly. You've got companies like Northwest Mutual. You've got Metavante. You've got Fiserv. There are people that can attract the talent here, and those are the companies that we're seeing the growth in. So financial services, healthcare, obviously. I mean, that's something that's going to get bigger and bigger throughout the nation. So we can do it, but I think we have to be more aggressive in promoting this community. That's part of my whole desire, is to let people know what a great community this is. Do we have challenges like crime? Absolutely. But they are not insurmountable challenges.
You mentioned the assets and the Olympics coming to Chicago. What's the strategic thought about leveraging Milwaukee with Chicago, building a world-class regional economy and competitive in the global society that we live in?
Well, tomorrow morning I will be going down to Chicago, taking the train to Chicago. to appear with the mayor of Madison before an Amtrak committee to talk about high-speed rail. And to tie this in even further, having had conversations with the mayor of Chicago and his staff about the Olympics and what the importance of the Olympics would be to Chicago and to this region, one of the issues that flows to the surface is this would be an opportunity for us to work with the federal government to improve the mass transit in this region. Again, when we were in China, in Beijing, they are preparing in massive ways for the Olympics in 2008 in Beijing. We've got 8 years. You're asking me what my fantasy is in terms of Chicago is that by the 2016 Olympics that we've got high-speed rail connecting our communities. And I think that would be a huge benefit for both communities.
Other questions? Yes.
In terms of, spoken a lot about the image of Milwaukee. The thing that has been in the news recently, and it has been over the last many years, and I hear from friends of mine outstate, continual sewage dumps that happen in our rivers and in our lakes, and this gets to national press and statewide press. Is this something, and I know we have a number of projects, deep tunnel projects in the works, is this something that this costs too much money and is too far down the list of priorities to fix, or is this a fixable problem?
Well, it is much better than it used to be. How's that for? If you go back 20 or 30 years, before the deep tunnel was in place, there were a lot more discharges into Lake Michigan than there are now. The deep tunnel has been maligned by some, and it was built before I became mayor, so I can play Pontius Pilate and wash my hands of it. But the reality is it has reduced the number of discharges into Lake Michigan dramatically. In fact, Chicago is in essence going to be emulating us by putting in its own deep tunnel system. Now, what you do have is you have different parts of our community, and I mean our greater community, some where you have, in the older parts, and that would include here, combined sewers, where both the sanitary sewers and the stormwater sewers are together. And then you've got other areas where they're separated. There are some who say separate all the sewers. That would be a massive public works project that would rip up all of downtown Milwaukee, all the way north into Shorewood, and I don't think that, quite honestly, we could afford to do that. I think that in some regards it is overstated, and I'll tell you one of the things that I learned right after I became mayor. This was less than 2 months after I became mayor. We had huge rains, and so there were discharges into Lake Michigan. And it was sort of the sport in Chicago, quite honestly, to say, well, they had to close some beaches and they were blaming it on Milwaukee. And we saw the same thing out of Door County. And I said, only half in jest, I said, this will show you how sophisticated we are, because we would send our sewage out into Lake Michigan. We'd have some of it turn left, some of it turn right. And the beaches were not closed in Racine and Kenosha during this period. So we'd have our sewage go beyond the beaches in Racine and Kenosha. We'd actually have them go beyond the beaches on the north side of Chicago because we were in the same division as the Cubs. And then we'd have it turn right to the south side beaches because those are the beaches that were closed. And it was my way of saying this has nothing to do with it. And the EPA came in and said it had nothing to do with it, that there were other issues there. But I did find one of the few things that people in Milwaukee like even less than discharges of sewage into the lake is having Chicago blame us for their discharges, because what Chicago did is it turned around the Chicago River and puts everything in the Chicago River down towards the Mississippi. So that's how they've addressed that, but they've had a lot more discharges. And again, if you look at other cities on the Great Lakes, we've done a better job than almost all cities. But it's not perfect. It's, you're dealing with 2 million people. But I think the other thing that's interesting is in some of the outlying suburban areas where we've seen a lot of criticism, we're now finding communities who say, well, we'd like to hook up to the deep tunnel. And we're like, wait a minute, I thought you thought this was so bad. Well, all of a sudden they're seeing that although it's not perfect, that it works relatively well.
Other questions? Yes.
You mentioned both your stance that you want police force to be more aggressive, but at the same time you talk about neighborhoods where they don't report crime. How do you kind of mesh those two concepts when what is causing that failure report is distrust of police? So if you have police coming in being more aggressive with what they see as criminals, low-income young people, how do you mesh that aggressive police?
Well, again, this goes where I don't think that this is a simplistic press conference type approach. Again, what we're doing with police, more cops on the street, going after cruising, going after gangs, very aggressive going after illegal guns, and I'm going to be talking more about that publicly next week, the things that we're doing there, and that was before the horrible incident yesterday. But it takes more, and we had a meeting about 3 weeks ago where we had 300 to 400 people, many from the clergy, from community groups that came in, from the police department, it was something that I co-sponsored with the U.S. Attorney, people from the State Department of Justice, and trying to build the trust. And in the most concrete way, what I'm asking people to do is in each district station, once a month, they have essentially what's called a crime analysis meeting. And I would love to see those meetings become the real hallmark of change in Milwaukee in terms of building trust between the community and the police department. Because the citizens can go on a regular basis once a month, and it's really quite unique in our country to have this. And you've got the personnel from the police department who are there, who are talking about where the crime trends are, where the hot spots are. And so the more you can have the communities and the community work together, the more you can build that trust. But the challenge is you've got an organization where we're 1,900 plus sworn officers, 2,600 people altogether. Any organization that size, unfortunately, you're going to have someone who's a bad apple. And I firmly believe that the vast majority of people who work for the police department are wonderful public servants who are putting their life on the line every day. That can get lost in a Jude case, for example. And there are other ones. And so we're trying to make changes to that. But I need to have the police work together with the community. That's imperative if we're going to have better police. And you saw that. Again, the homicide that occurred on Sherman and Capitol Drive, it was the neighbors. It was an off-duty sheriff's deputy who came there. They were engaged. They worked with the police. They pointed to where the assailant was running to. By having that type of community involvement is going to help us reduce crime.
A comment that Tina Ann Kennedy made when she was here, the very first of her interview. She doesn't have the authority, police chiefs don't have the authority to fire, essentially, instigating police officers who have applied, become candidates to apply. I don't know the statutory limitations, and I do understand the legacy of Harold Breyer, but is it possible that the next chief could be given the authority to say, these candidates, no, because they're just not acceptable?
She has been more aggressive. What we have is, and some of this is a result of court decrees, where there's now a more objective system to rank people coming into the police department who want to apply. But she has made it known that if she goes, and she goes through them, that if she feels a person is not fit for that job, she's not going to hire him, no matter what that grid says. And it has not been challenged. Now maybe it will be challenged at some point. Usually these things are challenged at some point. But she has said, and I'm very supportive of her in this effort. For example, the fellow John Bartlett who was hired, he had been arrested at one point for fleeing an officer, I think in Door County, and taking his motorcycle and throwing it into the shrubbery and running. And my reaction is, well, how did this guy end up on the police department? You know, there are certain things where you're saying, well, what happened here? So the other thing that we have done, and we worked together on this, and this is the first time that we've done this, it is very important for us to have an aggressive police department, and I've said that over and over again. But it's also important for us to have the right people working for the police department. And for the first time ever, we have instituted psychological testing for people coming onto the police department. Because again, this is a job that many people in this room, including myself, probably couldn't do or wouldn't want to do. Because it is, you know, a lot of times, and we see this very often, you get a domestic call, you go there, they're screaming at each other, and within 2 minutes they're both screaming at you. You know, that you become the most hated person as opposed to them hating each other. And it can be a very stressful job. So I think you have to have the right psychological makeup. So we have instituted that, and we were surprised in the first class how many people washed out. We had 22% of the people wash out of the first class on the psychological testing. Now, the class that we're bringing in June, I just asked this question earlier this week, the numbers are much better on this one. So that's good. Yeah.
Where do regional business and economic organizations come into the business in Milwaukee? What does the city already do or could the city do to work more?
Well, after becoming mayor, I took a virtually unprecedented step as mayor of the city, I traveled west and officially recognized the existence of Waukesha County. This was something that had never been done before, and I toured it and realized they weren't all Quonset huts, and they actually were some homes there and factories that had been there. But this region had been marked by decades of really internal warfare. And again, just laying it right out on what I think, I often compare it to two guys standing in a corner of a bus station arguing over which guy gets the window seat on the bus. And while they're arguing, the bus pulls out of the station. And in some regards, I think that that's what's happened in southeast Wisconsin. When you look at our dropping in the ranks of economic growth and population growth, I think part of that, not all of it, but I think part of that has been due to the fact that we have spent so much time fighting with each other over housing, over transportation, over water, over sewers, and we're still going to have some of these disagreements. And I'm not going to make believe we're not going to have some of those disagreements, but I think that we also have to realize that there's more that unites us than combines us. And again, I'm going to keep going back to China. When we went to China, the theme was not the equivalent of, we want you to locate on this side of 124th Street or this side of 124th Street. It was, we want you here. We want you here. And then we'll figure out, and I went to Ireland and it was the same thing. So to the extent that we are fighting with each other, it's a losing zero-sum game approach. It's a loser approach. So right after being elected, I was very active working with the MMAC, the GMC, to create what's now known as the Milwaukee 7. And it is the 7 counties in southeastern Wisconsin that for the first time in our existence have banded together to promote ourselves together economically. Now what does that mean? If you have a company that wants to locate here, I'm the mayor of Milwaukee. I'm going to do everything I can to get them in the city of Milwaukee. That's my job. I expect the mayor of Waukesha, the mayor of Racine to do the same thing. But if there's an issue where they're going to move to southeast Wisconsin and they don't want to be in Milwaukee, I'd much rather have them in Caledonia or Wauwatosa than Walla Walla, Washington. So there are different gradations there because we've got a lot of people who now live in the city and work in the suburbs and vice versa. So of course I want my tax base to grow first. But second, I want to have this region grow. And it's a necessity. And what we did is we looked at other parts of the country. You've got, again, pointing to Chicago, they have a 9-county region that works together to promote the Chicago region. It's called World Business Chicago. Cincinnati has 15 counties that actually go into 3 states called Cincinnati, USA, to promote the region. We never had that. And again, this may to some sound trivial, but it'll show you how far we've come. I honestly believe, as recently as 5 years ago, if you were going to have an organization like this, you would have to have called it the Walworth, Racine, Kenosha, Washington, Ozaukee, Waukesha, Milwaukee Economic Development Group, because nobody would give up any turf. We made the case, and others made the case, that you like it or not, Milwaukee's the economic center of this region. And when you travel somewhere in this country or you travel somewhere around the world, you don't say, I'm from Caledonia. And you don't say, I'm from Grafton. You say, I'm from Milwaukee, the Milwaukee area. And so the fortunes of this region are very intertwined with how Milwaukee is perceived, going back to your very first question. So that our challenge is to promote in a positive way Milwaukee so that this entire region benefits from it. And so now we have, for example, down at We Energies, there's a brand new center that companies come into where we do our dog and pony show to show them the region and the different things in the region that are positive. So I have been accused by some of being too regional of a mayor because I'm not going to swear at the people who don't live in the city of Milwaukee. I don't think it's a mortal sin to not live in the city of Milwaukee. I would rather have people live in the city of Milwaukee, but I understand where for various reasons people do it. Now, having said all that, I was just looking at some statistics this morning, and this should give some optimism to you for those of you who love Milwaukee. If you look at a large group of our peer cities, we are third among the group in terms of the percentage of people in a metropolitan area who live within the city. What I'm saying is, if you look at cities like St. Louis or Detroit or Pittsburgh or Cleveland or Cincinnati, the exodus from the city has been far more dramatic than the exodus from the city here. We're down maybe 20% from our peak population in 1960, 1970, but we're still over 40% of the metropolitan area. The only 2 communities that have a higher percentage are Indianapolis, Indiana, which is a city-county, they've combined the city and county, and Columbus, Ohio, which has essentially done the same thing. So we're at the top. We're higher than Chicago, for example, higher than Minneapolis in terms of the percentage of people who live in this metropolitan area who actually live in the city, which is all the more reason for people not to abandon the city of Milwaukee.
I think there's a chance, and this will be, I guess, the final word here, because I want to be respectful of your time, but is there a chance that Milwaukee's population will actually not only stabilize, but grow in the future? Do you see that?
I see that.
Given the growth
I do see it, and in fact, we are preparing for that right now. And when I say preparing for that, each year we have the census that comes out, and we haven't liked the federal census numbers. And I've had meetings already with the city attorney's office to say, let's be prepared to challenge this. And I think, again, historically, cities have attracted immigrants. And the growth you see in places like Chicago and New York are primarily immigrants. That's the history of America. And I think that you'll continue to see that. But I think, again, the fact that we have more people moving to downtown, the 3rd Ward, the 5th Ward, Brewers Hill, you are seeing more people that see the value in being near exciting restaurants, being near the lakefront, being near the river. If you want to have excitement in your life, live in the city. If you want, to be very quiet and laid back, then you might not want to live in the city. But think about Europe. Think about the cities in Europe, the Paris and the Londons. You have the wealthy people. In other parts of the world, you have the wealthy people who live in the cities. It's only an American phenomenon where the wealth has left the cities. And I think you're starting to see a little bit of a Europeization, if you want to call it that, where you're having people, whether they're empty nesters, whether they're young professionals, who are saying, I like the urban lifestyle. I find it exciting. I find it invigorating. And so that's, I think, the challenge, to keep that going.
Before we go and before we say thanks to Mayor Barrett, I did want to mention, we're getting near the end of the semester, we're going to try and do one more of these newsmaker appearances next week on Tuesday, if you're available. I think it'll be really good. We've been able to make arrangements with Jim Santel, who is a prosecutor with the U.S. Attorney's Office here in Milwaukee, but has spent the last 14 months in Iraq as the Justice Attaché at the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. He's willing to come in and talk about his experiences as they try to establish the rule of law in Iraq. So again, that's Tuesday at 12:15. So if you have any time available, we'd love to see you there. Having said that, thanks so much for attending, and let's thank Mayor Barrett.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.